The evening sun painted the sky in shades of gold as a calm breeze swept through the quiet neighborhood. A man named David had just finished unpacking the last of his boxes. He looked around his new home with a gentle smile. It wasn't grand or luxurious, but it was his. A peaceful little house where he could finally live a quiet life. After years of traveling and serving his country, this was the peace he had always dreamed of. He placed a photo frame on the table, one that showed him standing with a group of people dressed in uniforms, smiling with pride. It was a reminder of his past, but also a chapter he had chosen to close. He didn't talk much about what he had done before or where he had been. He just wanted to be an ordinary man in an ordinary neighborhood. Every morning, David would wake up early, make himself a cup of black coffee, and sit on the porch as the sun came up. The air was fresh, the streets were quiet, and for the first time in years he felt free from noise, orders, and missions. He had been through battles most people couldn't imagine, but now he was just a man with a garden and a dream of peace. In the first few weeks, some neighbors greeted him with polite smiles. A few waved when he passed by, but not everyone was friendly. There were some who gave him long, suspicious looks. A couple of people whispered when he walked past their homes. He didn't pay much attention to it. He believed that kindness and patience could win over anyone. One evening, while David was watering his plants, a group of young men drove by in a pickup truck. They slowed down in front of his house and shouted something cruel. The words stung, not because they were loud, but because they came from a place of hate. David didn't respond. He simply stood still, looking at his garden as if he hadn't heard a thing. When the truck disappeared down the road, he went back inside quietly. That night, as he sat on the couch, he thought about the world he had seen. He had fought alongside people of all colors and backgrounds. In the Navy, no one cared about race. They only cared about trust, courage, and teamwork. To him, a man's worth was never about his skin, but about his heart. Yet here he was, facing hate in a quiet neighborhood for no reason other than existing. He took a deep breath and let it go. He had faced worse. He wasn't going to let a few ignorant people steal his peace. The next morning, he woke up early again and started painting the fence. As he worked, a little boy from next door came over, curious. "Are you building something?" the boy asked shyly. David smiled and handed him a small brush. "Just fixing things up," he said. The boy helped him paint for a while, talking about school and his dog. It made David smile, a simple, pure conversation that reminded him there was still good around. But not everyone shared that innocence. That evening, when David stepped outside to throw away the trash, he noticed a piece of paper stuck on his door. It had a few hateful words scribbled in red ink. His jaw tightened for a second, but he didn't tear it down right away. Instead, he looked at it calmly, then folded it and placed it in the bin. He knew what kind of people did things like this, cowards who hid behind darkness and fear. Over the next few days, little things started happening. His mailbox was dented one morning. Another day, someone had let the air out of his car tires. Each time, he quietly fixed the damage and went about his day. He didn't complain to anyone or make a scene. He was too disciplined for that. Years of training had taught him that losing control only gave power to the wrong people. But inside, he knew this wasn't just a few pranks. He could feel a pattern. The same truck passed by every few nights, its headlights slowing near his driveway. The same voices echoed in the dark. His instincts told him that something worse might come. One night, as rain tapped softly against his windows, David sat at his desk, writing a letter to a friend he had served with. He paused when he heard the rumble of an engine outside. He turned off the lamp and peered through the curtain. The same truck again, slowly cruising by. This time he caught a clearer look at the faces. They were young, loud, and unaware that the man they were mocking had once faced dangers far greater than anything they could imagine. He made a mental note of the details, the make of the truck, the partial plate number, and the number of people inside. He didn't plan to fight or confront them. He wasn't that kind of man, but he always believed in being prepared. The next morning, he installed a small security camera near the porch. He didn't tell anyone, didn't call the police, just took quiet precautions. Years of serving in the field had made him alert but calm. He could handle himself, but he never sought trouble. Days went by. Some mornings were peaceful, some filled with tension. One afternoon, while David was mowing his lawn, an elderly lady from down the street stopped to talk. "I see you've been fixing this place up," she said kindly. "It's nice to have someone who takes care of their home." Her words meant more to him than she realized. For a moment, it reminded him that not everyone was against him, but that peace didn't last long. That weekend, David went out to run errands. When he came back, he froze at the sight before him. His white fence was covered in spray paint. Ugly, hateful words stretched across it. A garbage bag had been thrown on his porch and a broken bottle lay near the door. He stood there for a long moment, silent. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, watching but saying nothing. Some turned away. No one came to help. David didn't shout. He didn't curse. He simply walked inside, grabbed a bucket of water and a scrub brush and started cleaning. Each stroke of the brush was slow and steady. He didn't rush, didn't complain. The more he cleaned, the calmer he seemed to become. By the time the sun went down, most of the paint was gone. His hands were sore, but his heart was steady. He knew people expected him to react, to get angry, but that wasn't who he was. He had learned long ago that dignity in silence was stronger than any words shouted in rage. That night he sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the quiet street. The same truck passed by again. This time it didn't stop. Maybe they were surprised that he hadn't broken down. Maybe they were planning something else. David leaned back in his chair, his eyes calm but alert. He could feel that the story wasn't over yet. Trouble had a way of returning when people thought they'd gotten away with something, but he wasn't afraid. He had seen too much in his lifetime to fear a few reckless men. He looked at the stars above and whispered to himself, "Peace isn't given. It's something you protect." As he sat there, the wind carried the faint sound of laughter from a distance, the same cruel laughter he had heard before. But instead of anger, a small smile appeared on his face. He knew that when people acted out of hate, it was because they were weak inside, and he knew that true strength never needed to prove itself. Inside his home, the lights were warm, the air calm. On his wall hung a folded flag and a few medals, reminders of a life where courage meant protecting others, not hurting them. No one in the neighborhood knew who he really was. To them, he was just a quiet man living alone. But if they only knew the truth, that the man they mocked and harassed was once part of one of the most elite forces in the world, they would have thought twice. He didn't want them to know. He didn't need validation. All he wanted was to live in peace. Yet deep inside, something told him that peace was about to be tested, and this time he wouldn't be able to avoid it. The night grew darker. The wind picked up. David locked his door, checked the camera feed, and walked to his room. He wasn't scared, just ready in case his instincts were right. Before sleeping, he glanced once more at the photo on his bedside. His old team, smiling proudly after a successful mission. He whispered softly, "Old habits never die." He turned off the light, unaware that the next few days would change everything. And as the clock ticked past midnight, a distant sound of an engine echoed down the road. The storm was coming, and this time, David would be ready. The next morning began like any other. The air was cool, the sky still a little gray from the night's rain. David woke up early, just as he always did. He made his coffee, opened the window, and let the soft light fill the room. But even though the day looked calm, something in his gut told him that peace wouldn't last long. He stepped outside to check the yard. His fence looked clean, the garden still neat, but the silence around him felt heavier than usual. Normally, he would hear kids playing or dogs barking in the distance, but this morning, there was nothing. Just quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel watched. He walked to the edge of his driveway and noticed tire marks on the wet pavement. Thick, fresh ones. They curved near his gate and then turned away sharply. He crouched down and studied them. The pattern was familiar, probably from the same truck that had been circling around at night. His instincts, sharpened from years of training, told him these weren't random. Someone had stopped here again while he was asleep. David didn't let the uneasiness show on his face. He stood up calmly and looked around, pretending to check his plants, but his eyes scanned every corner. Windows, rooftops, parked cars. Every sound, every movement. To others, he looked like an ordinary man watering his garden. But in his mind, he was already gathering clues, putting together pieces like he used to do in the field. After breakfast, he drove into town to buy a few supplies, new locks, an outdoor light, and an extra security camera. At the store, the cashier, a middle-aged man, gave him a friendly nod. "You knew around here, right?" he asked. David smiled lightly. "Yeah, just trying to make the place feel like home." The cashier nodded again, but his tone turned cautious. "You be careful. Some of the kids around here, they think they can do whatever they want." David only replied, "Thanks. I'll keep that in mind," and left quietly. When he returned home, he installed the new locks, checked his camera system, and replaced one of the lights near the porch. It wasn't fear that pushed him to do it, it was preparation. He had learned long ago that being ready for the worst kept you safe. That afternoon, while tightening the bolts on his gate, he heard the sound of a car door closing across the street. He looked up and saw his elderly neighbor, Mr. Harris, standing by his mailbox. The old man hesitated, then walked over slowly. "You fixing that fence again?" the man asked gently. David nodded. "Just keeping it sturdy." There was a pause before the old man spoke again. "I saw those boys around the other night. I didn't want to get involved, but I think they've been planning something. You might want to let the police know." David gave a small smile. "Thank you. I'll handle it." Mr. Harris looked at him closely, as if trying to read something in his calm face. Then he nodded and went back to his yard. That evening, David sat inside watching the camera feed. He saw a few cars pass by, nothing unusual. But around midnight, the same truck appeared again, slowing near his mailbox. It stopped for a few seconds, long enough for one of the men inside to throw something toward his lawn. The sound of glass breaking echoed in the night, followed by laughter. Then the truck sped away. David stood up, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped outside. He found a small glass bottle shattered near his porch. It didn't catch fire, didn't explode, just broke. It was more to scare him than to harm him. He picked up the pieces with his gloved hands and dropped them into a bucket. Inside the house, he replayed the footage, zooming in on the license plate. It was slightly blurry but readable. He noted the number down in a small notebook. For now, he wouldn't call anyone. He wanted to gather enough proof first. The next morning, while cleaning his porch, he noticed two of the young men from the truck walking past on the sidewalk. They pretended not to see him, whispering and laughing to themselves. David looked at them only once, his eyes calm but sharp. The kind of look that made both of them go quiet for a second before walking faster. He knew they were testing him, trying to see if he would react. But he also knew their kind, loud when they felt strong, silent when faced with real strength. Days passed quietly after that. The truck didn't come for a while. David went back to his routine, mowing the lawn, fixing things, keeping to himself. The neighbors began to notice his discipline. Some started greeting him more often. It seemed the tension was finally fading away. But peace, as he had learned in life, was always temporary. One Friday evening, while David was cooking dinner, he heard a knock on his door. It was light at first, then louder. When he opened it, 2 police officers stood outside. "Sir, we received a report about some vandalism last week. We just wanted to check if you've had any trouble," one of them said politely. David nodded. "A few things happened, yes. I've got some video evidence if you'd like to see it." They followed him inside, and he showed them the recorded clips. The officers watched in silence as the video played. The truck, the voices, the broken glass. When it ended, one of them sighed. "That's enough proof to identify the suspects. You did the right thing keeping calm." They took the footage and thanked him. Before leaving, one of the officers asked, "By the way, sir, are you military?" David paused, smiled slightly, and replied, "A long time ago." The officer nodded respectfully, as if sensing there was more to the man than he let on. That night, David sat on his porch again. The air was cooler than usual and the street was quiet. He took a sip of coffee and looked up at the stars. He didn't know what the police would do next, but part of him knew it wasn't over. People like that didn't stop easily. He thought back to his time in service, the long missions, the moments where fear had to be swallowed, the nights he spent waiting in silence for danger that might never come. It felt similar now, except this time the war wasn't on foreign soil. It was right here in his own neighborhood. Late that night, while checking his cameras before bed, he noticed something unusual. A shadow moved near the fence line, fast but clumsy. Then another. He zoomed in and his chest tightened. 3 figures were moving near the side of his house. He turned off all the lights, moved quietly, and grabbed the small flashlight he kept near the kitchen drawer. He didn't open the door. He just waited, listening. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped. A few seconds later, he heard a faint whisper. followed by a sound of metal scraping. Someone trying to pry the back gate open. He stayed calm. His heart rate didn't rise. His breathing stayed even. Slowly, he picked up his phone and called the police. His voice was low but clear. "This is David. The suspects are back. They're behind my house right now." The operator told him to stay inside. He did exactly that. Minutes felt like hours. He could still hear them moving outside, laughing softly, unaware that their every move was being recorded again. Then, in the distance, the faint wail of sirens began to rise. The sound grew louder. The laughter outside stopped. David watched from the window as the truck's headlights turned on suddenly. The men ran, jumped in, and sped off. Within moments, police cars appeared from both ends of the street, lights flashing red and blue. They chased after the truck as it disappeared into the night. David exhaled slowly, his hand still steady. He didn't feel triumph, just quiet relief. He knew this wasn't the end, but the beginning of the truth coming to light. A few minutes later, one of the officers returned to his door. "We've got their vehicle description. We'll find them soon." "You did the right thing, sir." David nodded. "Thank you. I just want peace." The officer gave him a respectful nod before leaving. When the street fell quiet again, David stood on his porch, looking out at the flashing lights fading into the distance. He took a deep breath and looked up at the dark sky. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled like thunder. Inside, he reviewed the footage again. Clear, solid proof. He knew justice would take its course eventually, but what the men didn't know was that the person they had been targeting wasn't just some quiet man who moved into the neighborhood. He was a man who had survived battles they couldn't even imagine. A man who had spent years mastering patience, discipline, and control. He smiled faintly to himself and whispered, "You picked the wrong house." Then he turned off the monitor, locked his doors, and sat back down with his coffee. His body relaxed, but his eyes remained alert. He had learned to rest with one part of his mind still awake. As the night faded into dawn, the first rays of sunlight touched the house again, standing strong, untouched, and still peaceful, just like the man who lived inside. And though the storm had not yet passed, David knew one thing for sure. He wasn't the one who needed to be afraid anymore. The following week passed slowly, each day carrying a quiet tension. David continued his routine, tending his garden, fixing small things around the house, and keeping an eye on the street. The neighborhood looked normal, but he knew appearances could be deceiving. He had learned to trust his instincts, and they told him that the young men who had been harassing him were planning something bigger. On a Thursday evening, the sun dipped below the horizon in shades of deep orange. David had just finished making dinner and was washing the dishes when he heard the faint rumble of a car outside. He paused, listening carefully. The sound was deliberate this time, slow and steady, as if someone wanted him to notice. He finished rinsing the last plate, wiped his hands, and moved quietly to the living room window. Through the blinds, he saw the truck he had seen before. 3 young men were inside, laughing and shouting at each other. They had brought bottles, cans, and sticks with them. From the way they moved, it was clear they weren't just driving by this time. They were looking for trouble. David didn't panic. His heart didn't race. Instead, he watched silently, noting every detail. The way they positioned themselves, the tools they held, the timing of their movements. He remembered all the lessons from his years of training. Observe first, act second. There was no need for anger, no need for impulse. Calm and strategy would always win. As the truck stopped in front of his house, one of the young men got out. They began smashing his mailbox, kicking over a flower pot and throwing trash onto his porch. The sound of breaking wood and falling objects echoed through the quiet street. David didn't step outside yet. He stayed behind the window, calm, assessing their behavior. In his hand, he held a flashlight and a small walkie-talkie he had bought the previous week. He hadn't called the police yet. He wanted to make sure he had everything under control and documented first. The men laughed louder, thinking their actions would scare him. One of them threw a bottle at the front door, but it bounced harmlessly off the frame. They were reckless, careless, confident that he would not respond. David quietly dialed the police on his phone. His voice was steady and calm as he explained the situation, giving exact details about the men, their vehicle, and the objects they had with them. He repeated the license plate, the number of people, and their direction when they left. He didn't shout or panic. Every word was precise, every action deliberate. While waiting for the police, he turned back to the window. The truck was still parked, the young men now trying to pry open the gate on the side of the house. They had no idea he was watching, no idea he was prepared. He remembered something he had learned in the Navy. Presence alone can stop people from acting. Confidence, calmness, and control can speak louder than words or weapons. David slowly opened the front door a little, enough to make his shadow visible. The men froze immediately. There was no shouting, no threats, just David, standing tall in the doorway, his posture calm, his eyes focused. They had no idea who he really was, but somehow, even without knowing, they felt the weight of authority in his presence. The laughter stopped. The bottle they had been about to throw fell from one of their hands. The faint sound of sirens came in the distance. David had timed it perfectly, ensuring that the police would arrive before things got worse. The young men glanced at each other, confused, unsure whether to run or continue. As the sirens grew louder, David didn't move. He stayed in the doorway, calm, steady, ready. The truck's engine roared to life suddenly, and the men jumped in, driving away as fast as they could. The police arrived moments later, lights flashing, and began securing the area. David stepped outside after they left. He looked at the yard, littered with fallen flower pots and scattered trash. He didn't curse, didn't shout. Instead, he cleaned up quietly, knowing that keeping composure was more powerful than losing it in anger. The officers, still on the scene, approached him. "Sir, are you okay?" one of them asked. David nodded. "Yes, I'm fine. I just want everything documented." One officer glanced at him curiously. "You handled yourself very well back there." "Most people would have panicked." David gave a small smile. "Years of training. You learned to stay calm." The officer's eyes widened slightly, sensing there was more to the man than he let on. "Military?" he asked. David simply nodded. "A long time ago. I just try to stay prepared." The rest of the night passed quietly. David stayed awake, checking the security footage repeatedly. Every movement of the young men, every careless action was recorded clearly. He knew this would help the authorities identify them fully. The next morning, he went outside to inspect his property. The damage was minor, some broken pots, a bent gate latch, and nothing permanent. But David saw it differently than the attackers had intended. To him, it was evidence, not a threat. Each piece told a story of recklessness, fear, and lack of awareness. As he walked around, one of the neighbors, a middle-aged woman, approached him. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. David smiled. "Yes, it's fine. Just a little mess to clean." She looked at him curiously. "You didn't seem scared at all last night." "Most people would have been shaking." He shrugged gently. "Fear is normal, but control is stronger." She nodded slowly, as if trying to understand, and walked away. David turned back to his house and began repairing the small damage from the night. Every nail, every hinge, every piece of wood he fixed with care. He worked methodically, deliberately, quietly. Later that day, the police returned. They had identified the truck and the suspects. David gave them the footage again and explained everything that had happened. They listened, taking notes carefully, impressed by his calm approach. "You've handled this very well," one officer said. "We'll take it from here. You've done more than most people could." David simply nodded. He didn't want praise. He didn't need it. To him, the important thing was that justice would follow, and that he could continue living peacefully in his home. That night, as he sat on the porch with a cup of tea, David thought about the events. He didn't feel anger toward the attackers. He felt a quiet satisfaction. They had tested him, and he had remained composed. He had protected himself without losing control. He thought back to his time in the Navy. Every mission had taught him patience, observation, and self-control. That training, once meant for life and death situations far from home, had helped him here in a quiet neighborhood, against people who didn't understand him. He looked at the sky, stars twinkling faintly above, and whispered to himself, "Peace is something you earn, not something given." The following days were calmer. The young men were no longer seen near his house. The police continued their investigation, and David kept up his routine, watering the garden, fixing small things, checking the cameras, and staying alert. Neighbors began to notice his dedication and calm demeanor. Some stopped by to greet him. Some offered help with cleaning the yard. For the first time since moving in, David felt a subtle sense of connection with the people around him. He still kept to himself mostly, but there was a quiet respect growing. He didn't need attention or recognition. What mattered to him was living with dignity and being prepared for whatever life might throw at him. One evening, as he was checking the cameras, he noticed a familiar figure walking past, one of the young men who had attacked him. This time he walked quickly, avoiding eye contact. David didn't confront him. He didn't need to. The man's change in behavior told the story on its own. David leaned back in his chair, a small smile on his face. He had faced threats far greater in his life. This was nothing compared to that. What mattered was that he had stayed calm, stayed prepared, and stayed true to himself. And as he looked at his home, standing quiet and still in the neighborhood, he knew one thing. He had survived another test. Another challenge that could have broken a man, but instead had only strengthened him. In the quiet of his house, David felt a deep sense of peace. The storm had come, yes, but he had weathered it without anger, without fear, and he knew that no matter what came next, he was ready. The sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the street. The air was calm, the night quiet. David sipped his tea, listening to the gentle rustle of leaves, knowing that life would continue. But now, he had proven something not just to the world, but to himself. That courage wasn't loud. That strength didn't need to shout, and that calm, steady presence could conquer even fear itself. And though he didn't yet reveal his past to anyone, the truth of who he was lingered quietly, like a shadow behind his calm eyes, waiting for the moment it might be needed. The following week brought a quiet that felt almost unreal to David. The truck had not been seen since the incident, and the neighborhood seemed calmer. For the first time in days, he could enjoy the soft morning light without the tension pressing against his chest. He tended his garden, trimmed the hedges, and even painted the small fence near the driveway, methodically smoothing out each stroke. But calm was not the same as forgetting. David kept an eye on the street as always. Instinct told him that people like the young men who had harassed him didn't vanish so easily. They either planned a return or left a trail of trouble for someone else. Yet he remained patient, knowing that the law would catch up with them. One afternoon, a group of police officers returned to his house. They were polite, professional, and careful in their approach. "We've identified the suspects," one officer said. "Thanks to the footage you provided, we can now move forward with charges." David nodded calmly. "I'm glad to hear that. I just want things resolved without further harm." The officers glanced around his home, noticing the security cameras, the careful arrangement of tools, and the meticulous way the yard was kept. One officer raised an eyebrow. "You're very prepared. Most people wouldn't have handled this so well." David smiled faintly. "Years of training taught me to stay calm and stay ready. That's all." As the officers left, one lingered a moment longer. "You were military, weren't you?" he asked. David paused, then nodded. "Yes, a long time ago. But that part of my life is mostly behind me now." The officer's expression changed slightly, a mix of respect and curiosity. He didn't press further, understanding perhaps that some stories were better told slowly or not at all. Word began to spread quietly through the neighborhood. People who had seen the truck, who had witnessed the vandalism, began talking among themselves. They noticed how David had remained composed, how he had cleaned the mess without complaint, how he had dealt with the situation calmly yet effectively. Then, one day, the local newspaper reporter knocked on his door. "Sir, we heard about the incident and your handling of it," she said politely. "Would you be willing to share your story?" David hesitated. He didn't want attention. He didn't want to be the center of gossip or pride. But he realized that telling the story could help the neighborhood understand courage, discipline, and respect, lessons he had lived by his whole life. "I can talk about it," he said finally, "but only about the importance of calm and preparation. The rest, I'd rather keep private." The article came out a few days later. It described a quiet man who had defended his home with dignity and composure, outsmarting a group of reckless individuals without anger or violence. The words resonated with many in the town. People began looking at him differently, with curiosity, respect, and perhaps a touch of guilt for having judged him without knowing. One evening, while David was watering his garden, one of the neighbors approached him nervously. "I just wanted to say—" "I'm sorry for what happened," the man said quietly. I shouldn't have ignored it before. I should have spoken up. David nodded, not with anger, but with understanding. You did what you could. That's all anyone can do. A few days later, another officer stopped by. Sir, we've finalized the charges, he said. The young men will face consequences. But one more thing. Your record came up during our background check. We realized who you really are. We didn't expect this. David looked at him calmly. Who I am isn't important. What matters is that the right thing happens. The officer hesitated, then said, You were a Navy SEAL, an elite one, decorated. Your training, it's extraordinary. Most people wouldn't survive a fraction of what you've been through. The way you handled that situation, it wasn't luck. It was experience, skill, and discipline. David gave a small, humble smile. Experience teaches lessons, yes, but it's not about proving anything to anyone. News of his past spread quickly. Neighbors who had once looked at him with suspicion now looked at him with awe and admiration. The same people who had whispered behind closed doors began approaching him to apologize, to express respect, to understand the man they had underestimated. David never sought recognition. He didn't display medals or talk about missions. But the truth had a way of coming out. The young men who had harassed him now faced consequences, and the town began to see the quiet, disciplined man for who he truly was. One afternoon, a few neighbors gathered by his porch. We didn't know, one said. We saw you as quiet, maybe too quiet. We didn't understand. David looked at them, calm and steady. It's easy to judge someone by appearances, but real strength isn't about showing off or proving yourself. It's about how you handle challenges quietly and with integrity. Some nodded, others were silent, but all of them felt the weight of his words. It wasn't just a story about bravery. It was a lesson about character, patience, and dignity. In the weeks that followed, David began helping the neighborhood in small ways. He shared tips about security, talked to younger residents about respect and discipline, and quietly mentored those who were willing to listen. He didn't make speeches or demand attention. He simply lived by example, showing that courage and calm could coexist with kindness. The house that had once been vandalized now stood as a symbol. Not because of the damage it had suffered, but because of how it had been defended, maintained, and restored. David's presence in the neighborhood reminded people that appearances can be deceiving, and that quiet strength can have a profound impact. One evening, while sitting on his porch, David reflected on the events. The attacks had been frightening, yes, but they had also revealed something important. They had shown him that patience, preparation, and calmness could turn fear into power, and danger into a lesson for others. He thought about the young men who had attacked him. He didn't feel anger. He felt hope. Hope that they might learn from their mistakes, that they might understand that life had consequences for reckless behavior, and that real courage didn't come from intimidation. The police continued their work, ensuring that justice was served fairly. The community began to heal, learning from the experience, and David remained a quiet, steady presence in the neighborhood. People began approaching him for guidance, for advice, and even just to talk. He listened patiently, offering wisdom without judgment, sharing knowledge without boasting. Through it all, David remained the same man he had always been, humble, disciplined, and kind. His past as an elite Navy SEAL had given him tools, yes, but it was his character, patience, and calm demeanor that truly shaped the events in the neighborhood around him. And though people now knew who he really was, David never let it define him. He didn't want fame or admiration. He wanted respect, quiet, genuine respect, and he received it, not because of medals or achievements, but because of his actions, his integrity, and the way he treated those around him. By the end of that month, the neighborhood felt different. The whispers had turned into greetings. The fear had been replaced by admiration. The vandalism, though a dark moment, had become a turning point for many. A lesson in courage, respect, and the quiet power of a steady, disciplined heart. David looked at his home one evening, the sunset painting the sky in soft orange and pink. The yard was neat, the fence repaired, the garden thriving. He sipped his tea, watching the neighborhood come alive with life. Children played, neighbors greeted each other, and the quiet man who had once been misunderstood was now a figure of respect and inspiration. And though he rarely spoke of his Navy SEAL days, the lessons he had learned, patience, observation, calmness, and integrity were evident in every action. Every word, every quiet smile he offered. For David, it was never about recognition. It was about living rightly, protecting what mattered, and showing that true strength often spoke in silence, not in noise. Weeks passed, and the neighborhood began to feel lighter. The young men who had attacked David's house were being dealt with by the authorities, and word had spread about their recklessness. People walked a little taller, more aware that actions had consequences. David continued his quiet routines, tending the garden, fixing small things around the house, and keeping his home secure. Every task he did, no matter how small, carried a sense of order and calm that was almost contagious. He noticed the changes around him. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now smiled as he passed. Children waved and called out greetings, and even those who had whispered harsh words before seemed to hold a new respect for him. David didn't ask for acknowledgement or praise. He never sought attention. He simply carried on, showing the value of patience, discipline, and quiet strength through his actions. One afternoon, while repairing a section of the fence, a group of younger residents approached him cautiously. "We wanted to ask, could you teach us something?" one of them asked nervously. "About discipline or respect, or how to stay calm." David paused, studying their eager but hesitant faces. He put down the hammer and smiled gently. "It's not about learning to fight or prove yourself," he said. "It's about understanding who you are, staying steady when things get hard, and treating others with respect, even when they don't do the same. That is what keeps you strong." They listened intently as he explained simple lessons: staying aware of your surroundings, controlling your emotions, making thoughtful choices, and always thinking about the consequences of your actions. He used small, real-life examples rather than grand speeches. By the time he was finished, the group had learned more from his calm presence than any lecture could have taught. Meanwhile, the young men who had harassed him faced legal consequences. The police ensured that they were given a chance to reflect on their actions. The goal wasn't just punishment, but learning and growth. Community service, mentorship programs, and workshops on respect and inclusion became part of their path forward. David had insisted on this approach quietly, not for attention, but because he believed in the power of second chances. The neighborhood slowly healed. The graffiti was gone, the broken pots replaced, and the small dents in the fence were repaired. What had been a moment of hate and fear became a lesson in resilience, forgiveness, and community. David's calm strength had quietly transformed not only his own life, but the lives of those around him. One evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks, David sat on his porch sipping tea. The neighborhood was alive with laughter, children playing, neighbors chatting, and the occasional dog bark in the distance. He watched quietly, a gentle smile on his face. A neighbor he had once barely spoken to walked by and stopped. "I just wanted to say..." "Thank you," the man said softly, "for handling everything the way you did. You didn't just protect your home, yet you taught us something important." David nodded, his eyes calm and kind. "It wasn't about showing anyone. It was about doing what's right. That's all anyone can do." The man smiled, understanding something deeper than words could explain, and walked away. David turned back to his yard, noticing how the small garden he had tended now bloomed in full color. Each flower, each trimmed hedge, and each neat stone seemed to reflect the patience and care he put into everything, a symbol of the quiet strength that defined him. Weeks turned into months, and the changes in the neighborhood continued. The young men who had caused trouble were now participating in community programs, learning skills, discipline, and respect. Some even approached David to apologize and seek advice. He listened patiently, offering guidance and understanding, never anger, never pride. His actions quietly inspired others to improve themselves. David also started small initiatives to strengthen the community. He organized simple workshops on basic safety, communication, and teamwork. He didn't advertise them or ask for recognition. He only wanted to help people understand that strength came from calmness, patience, and the way one treated others. Slowly, the neighborhood became more connected, more aware, and more respectful. Through it all, David remained the same humble man he had always been. He never flaunted his past as a Navy SEAL. He didn't.